Today we delve into the multifaceted character of Jacob, the biblical patriarch, who stands not only as a pivotal individual, but also symbolizes the entirety of the nation of Israel. His narratives intriguingly resonate with those of King David and even bear thematic parallels to Greek tales, a connection we shall elucidate in this video. The cultural milieu from which the biblical authors drew inspiration is deeply rooted in the Canaanite mythos, with discernible imprints from both Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations. As we navigate the book of Genesis, it becomes evident that we are not merely traversing historical accounts, but rather engaging with a rich tapestry of storytelling. Our previous documentary on Abraham highlighted the mythological undertones present not just in the initial chapters of Genesis 1 through 11, but throughout. The narratives of Abraham and Isaac, for instance, strikingly mirror the tales of Athamas and Phrixus, where divine interventions replace potential child sacrifices with rams. In our exploration of the Tables of Nations, as showcased in our documentary on Noah's Curse, we discerned literary parallels between Noah and Lot. Both figures emerge from cataclysms, one aquatic and the other infernal. Their subsequent actions, influenced by wine, have profound implications for their descendants and the nations they represent. It's noteworthy that post-flood genealogies in Greek myths stand unique, diverging from Mesopotamian counterparts. Unlike the Bible, it does not get its stuff from the Mesopotamia pertaining to the genealogies. But the Greeks, there you have it. As we now turn our focus to Jacob, we find his narrative interwoven with elements reminiscent of Greek myths. Before we delve deeper, it's imperative to provide a succinct overview of Jacob's life. Join us on this enlightening journey. A summary of Jacob's life. Jacob, Isaac's son and Abraham's grandson, was born alongside his twin Esau. Their sibling rivalry began in the womb and would shape Jacob's life. Jacob, a homebody, was his mother Rebekah's favorite. Unlike his outdoorsy brother, he was more strategic and cunning. He cleverly traded a meal for Esau's birthright and, with Rebekah's guidance, deceived his nearly blind father to steal Esau's blessing. This deceit forced Jacob to flee to Padan Aram to escape Esau's wrath. En route to Haran, Jacob dreamt of a heavenly ladder and made a vow to God at Bethel. In Haran, he fell for his cousin Rachel and agreed to work 7 years for her hand in marriage. However, his uncle Laban tricked him into marrying Rachel's elder sister, Leah. Jacob then worked another 7 years to marry Rachel. Jacob's family grew rapidly, with his wives and their maids bearing him many children. However, tensions arose with Laban, leading Jacob to return to Palestine. On his journey, he wrestled with a mysterious man, or dare I say God, earning the name Israel. Back in Palestine, Jacob faced challenges, from reconciling with Esau to dealing with the fallout of his daughter Dinah's violation. Yet, he remained devout, building altars and seeking God's guidance. Tragedy struck when Rachel died, giving birth to Benjamin. Later, Jacob's sons, envious of his favoritism toward Joseph, sold Joseph into slavery and deceived Jacob out of his fate. Years later, during a famine, Jacob's sons traveled to Egypt for grain, only to discover Joseph was a now powerful Egyptian ruler. At 130, Jacob relocated his family to Egypt's Goshen region. As death approached, Jacob ensured he'd be buried in Canaan and prophesied his sons' futures. He passed away at 147 years of age, leaving a legacy that spanned generations. Jacob, Esau, and Echoes from Greek Mythology. Philippe Wajdenbaum's Microscope. I will be covering a series of examples from Dr. Philippe Wajdenbaum's book, Argonauts of the Desert. You should seriously look into this book as well.
Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his prayer, and his wife Rebekah conceived. The children struggled together within her. She said, If it is to be this way, why do I live?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, "2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples born of you shall be divided. One shall be stronger than the other. The elder shall serve the younger." Lanchius reigned over Argos after Dinah and begat a son Abas by Hypermnestra, and Abas had 2 twin sons, Acrisius and Proetus by Aglaia, daughter of Mantineus. These 2 quarreled with each other while they were still in the womb, and when they were grown up, they waged war for the kingdom. And in the course of the war, they were the first to invent shields. And Acrisius gained the mastery and drove Proetus from Argos. And Proetus went to Lycia to the court of Labatus, or, as some say, Amphianix, and married his daughter, whom Homer calls Antia. The tragic poets call her Snethaboia. His father-in-law restored him to his own land with the army of Lycians who occupied Tiryns, which the Cyclopes had fortified for him. They divided the whole of the Argive territory between them and settled it. Acrisius reigned over Argos and Proetus over Tiryns.
James George Fraser, in his work on Apollodorus' library, highlighted the striking similarities between these stories. Just as Acrisius and Proetus had their differences, biblical twins, Jacob and Esau, were adversaries. Yet destiny brought Jacob and Esau back together to divide their inherited land in Genesis 33. While Esau became the forefather of Edom, Jacob's lineage led to Israel in Genesis 36. The character of Proetus also finds mention in Homer's Iliad. Homer narrates an episode where Proetus, after initially welcoming the hero Bellerophon, deceitfully sends him to his father-in-law with a sealed letter, which secretly orders Bellerophon's execution. You'll remember this later. I want you to look at the comparisons between Proetus and Jacob, or Israel. Here are some parallels. Number 1, in both cases, they're born twins and fought in the womb before they're born. Jacob and Israel, if you will, from the Bible, with Esau, born as twins and fought with twin in the womb. Acrisius, which is the brother of Proetus, the twin brother, born as twins and fought with twin Proetus in the womb. 2, fought over territory with the twin, both in the Jacob Esau and the Acrisius and Proetus. They both fought over territory. 3, settled different lands at peace with the twin. Both cases, you have the Edomites with Esau, and you have Israel with Jacob. And in the Acrisius and Proetus one, settled different lands and was at peace with Proetus, ruled over Argos, while Proetus ruled Tiryns. Number 4, had a daughter, Dinah or Dinah. Both sound very similar. Number 5, daughter abused against their will. Once you get to number 5, you kind of have to ask yourself, born as twins, fought in the womb, fought over territory, finally made peace, and both ruled different lands. They both have a daughter that sounds similar. Then you get to number 5, and you find out that they both had daughters who were raped by people who claimed they loved her. In both narratives. Coinkadink? I think not. And you're going to see that as this entire video unravels more and more. Again, another parallel graph for you to look at. All of these are checked off. Now enters Heracles. Drawing parallels, Martin L. West observed similarities between the biblical story of Esau being deprived of his blessing and the Greek tale of the births of Heracles and Eurystheus. In the Bible, Genesis 27, an aging and visually impaired Isaac intends to bless his elder son Esau. He sends Esau hunting, promising a blessing upon his return. However, Rebekah, favoring Jacob, devises a plan. Given the stark difference in their physical appearance, Jacob's smooth skin versus Esau's hairiness, Rebekah uses goat hair to disguise Jacob. Fooled by this ruse, Isaac mistakenly blesses Jacob, foreseeing his dominance over his siblings in Genesis 27:29. After Jacob received Isaac's blessings, Esau returned from his hunt. Upon realizing the deception, he was heartbroken and pleaded with Isaac for a blessing of his own. Isaac, bound by his words, gave Esau a lesser blessing, stating that he would serve his younger brother, Jacob. This scenario mirrors an earlier biblical account where Noah blesses his sons, Shem and Japheth, and declares Canaan will serve them. Isaac's words foreshadow the destinies of their descendants, the nations of Israel and Edom, which we further explore in the books of Samuel and Kings in Argonauts of the Desert by Philippe Wajdenbaum. Angry and feeling betrayed, Esau contemplates killing Jacob. To protect their favored son, Rebekah advises Jacob to flee to her brother Laban and consider marrying one of his daughters. Scholar M.L. West draws a parallel between the biblical narrative and a tale from the Iliad. In the Iliad, Zeus is deceived by Hera, leading to the birth of Heracles and Eurystheus.
Zeus and fate, and Uranus that walks in the darkness struck me mad when we were assembled on the day that I took from Achilles the meed that had been awarded to him. What could I do? All things are in the hand of heaven, and Folly, eldest of Zeus's daughters, shuts men's eyes to their destruction. She walks delicately, not on solid earth, but hovers over the heads of men to make them stumble or to ensnare them. Time was when she fooled Zeus himself, who they say is the greatest whether of gods or men. For Hera, woman though she was, beguiled him on the day when Alcmena was to bring forth mighty Heracles in the fair city of Thebes. He told it among the gods, saying, "Hear me, all gods and goddesses, that I may speak even as I am minded. This day shall Elithua, helper of women who are in labor, bring a man-child into the world who shall be lord over all that dwell about, him who are of my blood and lineage." Then said Hera, all crafty and full of guile, "You will play false and will not hold to your word. Swear me, O Olympian, swear me, O great oath, that he who shall this day fall between the feet of a woman shall be lord over all that dwell about him, who are of your blood and lineage." Thus she spoke, and Zeus suspected her not, but swore the great oath, to his much ruing thereafter. For Hera darted down from the high summit of Olympus, and went to haste to the Achaean Argos, where she knew that the noble wife Astellinus, son of Perseus, then was. She being with child, and in her 7th month, Hera brought the child to birth, though there was a month still wanting. But she stayed the offspring of Alcmena, and kept back to Elithue. Then she went to tell Zeus, the son of Cronos, and said, "Father Zeus, Lord of lightning, I have a word for your ear. There is a fine child this day, Eurystheus, son of Selinus, the son of Perseus. He is of your lineage. It is well, therefore, that he should reign over the Argives on this day." On this Zeus was stung to the very quick, and in his rage he caught Folly by the hair, and swore a great oath that never should she again invade starry heaven and Olympus, for she was the bane of all. Then he whirled her around with the twist of his hands, and flung her down from heaven, so that she fell on the fields of mortal men. And he was ever angry with her when he saw his son groaning under the cruel labors that Eurystheus laid upon him.
West points out a fascinating parallel. Just as a father is about to favor one's son, a mother's intervention changes the course of events. This is evident in the story of Hera's jealousy in Greek mythology, which led to Heracles serving Eurystheus and undertaking the famous 12 labors. This mirrors Rebekah's scheme in the Bible, where Jacob deceives Isaac to receive Esau's blessing and have 12 tribes descend from him. West may have missed a connection, though. Both the tales of Acrisius and Proetus and that of Heracles and Eurystheus seem to be intertwined. Delving into Apollodorus' library, we find that Acrisius is the grandfather of the famed hero Perseus. Perseus, in turn, has descendants, including Heracles and Eurystheus. This shared lineage suggests that the biblical narrative of Jacob and Esau might have been influenced by these Greek myths. Interestingly, the stories of Jacob and David in the Bible seem to echo each other. Both faced deceit from a father-in-law, had wives who practiced idolatry, and dealt with family scandals involving their children. Look at this graph with me. You have parallels between Jacob and King David. 1, the treacheries of a father-in-law. Jacob faced treachery from his father-in-law Laban, who tricked him over and over. King David faced treachery from his father-in-law Saul. 2, wives committing idolatry. Jacob's wife Rachel committing idolatry, worshiping the teraphim, and took her father's idols, which he chased them out into the wilderness for. King David, David's wife Michal, committed idolatry, worshiping teraphim. Number 3, daughters defiled and avenged. Jacob's daughter Dinah was defiled and avenged by Simeon. David's daughter Thamar was defiled and avenged by Absalom. Number 4, sons commit incest. Jacob's son Reuben committed incest. David's son Absalom committed incest. David will commit murder by sending Uriah the Hittite to Joab, bearing a sealed letter instructing Joab to have him killed on the battlefield. This theme is found as well in the story of Proetus, as we talked about above. This is one of the first pieces of evidence that both stories of Jacob and David, being parallel, were modeled after the same sources and written by the same single author. In a nutshell, this shows whoever the author is in Genesis knows the story of David, and they're working off of the same narrative, probably because this is the same author according to Wajdenbaum, but at the very least, they are looking at the other narrative to construct the other narrative. Wajdenbaum thinks it's simple, Occam's razor, and this is the same author. But this also tells you something about the source from which the Bible author is getting their material. And that Proteus story where he sends Bellerophon, that where he sends him and he doesn't even know he's carrying the letter to his own self-destruction, is found in the Greek source. In the beginning of our discussion, we talked about how the order of stories from Greek sources was mixed up and changed by the author. But interestingly, in both the Greek stories and in Genesis 25 through 27 from the Bible, we see similar characters and events. Think of it like this. Jacob is like the character Eurystheus, and Esau is like Heracles. It's interesting to note that Esau, who's a tough hunter, trades his special family rights just for a simple bowl of soup. Now, Pseudo-Apollodorus didn't influence the Bible because it came much later, but many believe that the works of Homer, especially the Iliad, did. In fact, the Iliad seems to have inspired many stories about David in the book of Samuel, and the stories about Jacob seem to set the stage for those about David. When we don't have all the pieces of the puzzle from older sources, we use Apollodorus to help fill in the blanks. The stories about Heracles, for instance, are best understood through the writings by Apollodorus and Diodorus Siculus. It's essential to remember that amidst all these Greek tales, the Bible's main message is about the dangers of too much power, especially in kingship, and how it doesn't match the ideal vision of a perfect state. Jacob, as the father of the 12 tribes, is like the first version of Israel, and David is like a do-over or a second version. But David, with his misuse of power, ends up breaking this perfect vision. As we dive deeper into Jacob's stories, we will see even more similarities with the tales of Hercules. Jacob, Laban, Heracles, and Thespios. Simplified comparison. Jacob, seeking refuge from his brother's anger, journeyed to his uncle Laban's home. He desired to marry Rachel, Laban's younger daughter, and agreed to work for 7 years as her bride price. Yet Laban deceived him. On their wedding night, Laban secretly sent Leah, his elder daughter, to Jacob. It was only the next morning that Jacob realized the switch. Laban justified his actions by explaining that it was customary for the elder daughter to marry first. He then offered Rachel's hand in marriage if Jacob agreed to work another 7 years. This tale of deception mirrors another from Greek mythology.
Now this Thespios was king of Thespii, and Hercules went to him when he wished to catch the lion. The king entertained him for 50 days, and each night as Hercules went forth to the hunt, Thespios bedded one of his daughters with him, 50 daughters having been born to him by Medea, daughter of Arneus, for he was anxious that all of them should have children by Hercules. Thus Hercules, though he thought that his bedfellow was always the same, had intercourse with them all, and having vanquished the lion, he dressed himself in the skin and wore the scalp as a helmet.
Thespios wanted grandchildren from the strong and famous Heracles because he didn't have any sons. So he tricked Heracles into spending the night with each of his 50 daughters, one at a time. The catch? Heracles thought he was with the same woman every time. This story is similar to when Jacob ended up with Leah, thinking she was Rachel. From these relationships, Jacob had 12 sons, and Heracles' family later became rulers in Sardinia. There's another story about Jacob being constantly tricked by Laban, never getting what he worked hard for. This story reminds us of Laomedon, an ancient king of Troy. Laomedon once cheated two gods, Apollo and Poseidon, after they helped him build Troy's walls. As punishment, the gods wanted his daughter, Hesione, to be offered to a sea monster. Laomedon promised Heracles some fine horses if he'd save Hesione. But after Heracles did the job, Laomedon went back on his word. Angry, Heracles attacked and destroyed Troy. This story was later retold by Laomedon's son, Tepolemos, during a big battle in Troy just before he met his end.
Far other was Heracles, my own brave and lion-hearted father, who came here for the horses of Laomedon, and though he had 6 ships only, and few men to follow him, sacked the city of Ilius, and made a wilderness of her highways. You are a coward, and your people are falling from you. For all your strength, and all your coming from Lycia, you will be no help to the Trojans, but will pass the gates of Hades vanquished by my hand.
This narrative underscores another instance where Heracles faced deceit and broken promises. Look at this graph on the parallels. Just a couple to point out between Jacob and Heracles. Number 1, slept with the wrong woman. Jacob was tricked by Laban into sleeping with Leah. Heracles was tricked by Thespios into thinking he was sleeping with the same girl for 50 nights, but it was 50 different women. Number 2, deceived and given broken promises. Jacob was deceived by Laban with broken promises. Heracles was promised horses by Laomedon, the first king of Troy, who didn't keep his promises.
Then Jacob took fresh rods of poplar and almond and plane and peeled white streaks in them, exposing the white of the rods. He set the rods that he had peeled in front of the flocks, in the troughs, that is, the watering places, where the flocks came to drink. And since they bred when they came to drink, the flocks bred in front of the rods, and so the flocks produced young that were striped, speckled, and spotted. Jacob separated the lambs and set the faces of the flocks toward the striped and completely black animals in the flock of Laban, and he put his own droves apart, and did not put them with Laban's flock. Whenever the stronger of the flock were breeding, Jacob laid in the rods, in the troughs before the eyes of the flock, that they might breed among the rods, but for the feebler of the flock, he did not lay them there. So the feebler were Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's. Thus, the man grew exceedingly rich and had large flocks, and male and female slaves, and camels and donkeys. Mercury, gave to Autolycus, who he begat by Chion, the gift of being such a skillful thief that he could not be caught, making him able to change whatever he stole into some other form, from white to black, or from black to white, from a hornless animal to a horned one, from a horned one to a hornless. When he kept continually stealing from the herds of Sisyphus and couldn't be caught, Sisyphus was convinced he was stealing because Autolycus' number was increasing while his growing smaller. In order to catch him, he put a mark on the hooves of his cattle. When Autolycus had stolen in his usual way, Sisyphus came to him and identified the cattle he had stolen by their hooves and took them away. While he was delaying there, he seduced Anticla, the daughter of Autolycus. She was later given in marriage to Laertes and bore Ulysses. Some writers accordingly called him Sisyphean because of his parentage. He was shrewd.
Both Apollodorus' library and Aeginos's fables served as essential guides for young Romans, offering them a foundational understanding of Greek mythology. These texts preserved the essence of various myths and tragedies, including tales like Euripides' Phrixus. Jacob's method of increasing his livestock, which involved a seemingly magical process, mirrors the story of Autolycus and Sisyphus' cattle. This Greek tale was influenced by the Homeric hymn to Hermes, where the young god Hermes is depicted stealing Apollo's cattle. Hermes, interestingly, is Autolycus' father. The biblical writer used several Greek sources that involved a treacherous father-in-law, such as Thespios, who made Heracles sleep with 50 different sisters, Laomedon, who refused to pay horses to Heracles for his work, and Autolycus, who stole the cattle of Sisyphus. Though Laban is a deceiver, Jacob will retaliate and prove that he is an even greater trickster than his father-in-law. Let's look at this graph of parallels between Jacob and Autolycus. 1. Used magic with animals. Jacob used a magical practice to change the animals' colors and stripes, growing more livestock than Laban. Autolycus magically changed the animals stealing from the herds of Sisyphus. And his dad was Hermes, so he's the greatest trickster of all. And of course, 2 is that they're both tricksters. Jacob is known for his cunning and trickery in various stories as he tricked, his father, and Esau is over and over being a trickster, similar to how Hermes was. And then Autolycus is renowned as a master thief and trickster as well. I do want to highlight, just to make a point about this, that is absolutely necessary. And if you look carefully at both of those stories that we told you from Hyginus' fable and the Genesis account, Jacob is talking about striped, speckled animals. These are animals of black and white, different types of colors that they're trying to show that he's increasing his fold while Laban's is decreasing. It's so similar to what we're seeing here with Autolycus and how he is taking Sisyphus's animals. Literally, both are so close, it's hard to think that this is really a coincidence. More likely that the biblical author is using the Greek tale to kind of craft their narrative, as these other scholars like Russell Gamirkin and others have been pointing out. This story was probably written or crafted later using ancient sources, but the idea of the narrative structure is got to be after Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. After enduring 2 decades under Laban's manipulative tactics, Jacob decides to depart with his family and possessions. In a twist, Rachel discreetly takes Laban's teraphim, which are likely small household idols. When Laban pursues them, demanding his idols back, Jacob, unaware of Rachel's actions, challenges Laban to find them. Rachel clearly conceals the idols, ensuring their escape. This narrative finds a parallel in the story of David and Michal, where Michal uses similar tactics to deceive her father Saul and protect David. Such interconnected tales in the Bible highlight the importance of a reader's patience and memory to fully grasp the intricate web of stories. Jacob's subsequent encounter with Esau, after a long separation of 20 years, is filled with tension. One night, Jacob wrestles with an angel, managing to overcome the celestial being but sustaining a permanent limp in the process. When he finally meets Esau, they reconcile and divide their inheritance. Notably, Jacob's limp and Esau's red hair are motifs that will be echoed in the narrative of David. Again, Wajdenbaum's point. Your memory, if it serves you well and you could see the literary connectiveness of these stories, likely highlights a single mind. They crafted, compiling and connecting these narratives. Unless one wants to posit in some way a later author looks back or is looking forward when they compile this literature to connecting these stories. They're crafting narratives. I could understand why he thinks a single author. Violated Dinah and Helen. In Genesis 34, we encounter a troubling episode where Dinah, Jacob's daughter, is violated by Prince Shechem of the city bearing his name. In a bid for reconciliation, Jacob agrees to marry Dinah to Shechem and form an alliance with the Shechemites, but only if they undergo circumcision. However, in a twist of events, Dinah's brothers, Simeon and Levi, seeking vengeance for their sister, exploit the vulnerability of the Shechemites post-circumcision and execute a massacre. This biblical narrative finds a parallel in Greek mythology, particularly in the story of Helen's abduction.
And when Helen grew into a lovely woman, Theseus carried her off and brought her to Aphidnae. But when Theseus was in Hades, Pollux and Castor marched against Aphidnae, took the city, got possession of Helen, and led Aethra, the mother of Theseus, away captive.
Further elaborating on this tale, Theseus, in collaboration with Pirithous, had previously made a pact to wed daughters of Zeus. In line with this agreement, Theseus abducts a young Helen for himself. His ambitions don't stop there. He later descends into Hades, attempting to win Persephone for Pirithous. In his absence, the Dioscuri, with the aid of the Lacedaemonians and Arcadians, seize Athens. They not only rescue Helen, but also take Aethra as a captive. Meanwhile, Menestheus is reinstated as the ruler of Athens by the Dioscuri. I want you to check out this graph again, another comparative graph paralleling Dinah, daughter of Jacob, and Helen of Sparta. Number one, both were defiled by a prince, specifically a prince. 2, both were taken back by brothers, and specifically 2 brothers in both accounts. 3, Israel versus the Canaanites or the Shechemites, Sparta versus Athens. So you have Israel versus the Canaanites at Shechem, which are like the pre-Canaanites, and Sparta versus Athens. Number 4, Jacob and Ulysses' reluctance. You have Jacob did not want his sons to attack the Shechemites. Ulysses did not want his men to attack either. And in both cases, they did, against their parent, their leader, telling them what to do. They did the opposite. Number 5, attack and capture. Jacob's sons attacked, killing men and taking women and children captive. In the story, it specifically says they took men and women captive and attacked. Ulysses' men attacked, killing men and taking women and children captive. Kupitz noticed that Jacob bought a piece of land in Shechem for 100 kasita. He links this word with the Lydian currency Sistophorus, in short, kist. That would have given the Hebrew word kasita. This would be an obvious anachronism since that currency did not appear before the late 3rd century BCE. Kupitz also notices how Simon and Levi used a weapon in Hebrew called makera. That sounds exactly like the Homeric Greek machera, both meaning a sword, and so did the Rabbi Rashi notice this similarity. In Wajdenbaum's analysis, a textual parallel appears with Homer's Odyssey.
And the other sons of Jacob came upon the slain and plundered city because their sister had been defiled. They took their flocks and their herds, their donkeys, and whatever was in the city and in the field, all their wealth, all their little ones, and their wives that was in the houses. They captured and made their prey. There I stationed my ships in the river, bidding by men, stay by them and keep guard over them, while I sent out scouts to reconnoiter from every point of the vantage. But the men disobeyed my orders, took their own devices, and ravaged the land of the Egyptians, killing the men and taking their wives and children captive.
Reuben, Hippolytus, and Absalom, a comparative analysis. In the biblical narrative, while living in the land of Israel, Reuben had an affair with Bilhah, his father's concubine. This act was not hidden. Israel became aware of it. However, it was only at the end of his life that Jacob addressed this transgression, reprimanding Reuben and stripping him of his birthright. Jacob's words to Reuben were both a recognition of his status and a rebuke for his actions. Reuben, as my eldest son, you were the symbol of my strength and the first sign of my vitality. You had the highest status and the most power, but you acted impulsively. And because you violated my bed, you've lost your prominence. Drawing a parallel from Greek mythology, in Euripides' Hippolytus, Phaedra wrongfully accuses Hippolytus, Theseus' son, of violating her. This accusation is believed by Theseus, especially after Phaedra's suicide and the note she left behind. The tragic twist is that Phaedra was actually in love with Hippolytus, and her despair over her unrequited feelings led to her drastic actions. In his anguish and anger, Theseus calls upon his father, the god Poseidon, to take revenge on Hippolytus. He says,
I can't stay silent about this heinous act, even though it shames me to speak of it. Hippolytus has disrespected the sanctity of my bed and even the watchful eyes of the gods. Poseidon, you once promised to grant me 3 wishes. I invoke one now. End my son's life.
While Hippolytus is portrayed as innocent in Euripides' narrative, Reuben's guilt is clear in the biblical account. Both stories sharing a striking similarity. A son is accused of violating his father's marital bed. In Hippolytus' case, he faces a tragic end in a chariot accident, reminiscent of Absalom's fate in the Bible. Absalom, after violating his father David's concubines, meets his end when his hair gets entangled in a tree branch during a chariot ride, leading to his death at the hands of Joab. This incident comes after Absalom avenges his sister Tamar, who was violated by their half-brother Amnon. You can see how Jacob's story and David are connected. Well, this Greek mythology plays the underlying influence to these biblical ones. Both the Jacob and David narratives in the Bible contain reoccurring themes: a daughter's violation, her subsequent avengement by her brothers, and a son's incestual relationship with his father's concubines. In Jacob's final blessings in Genesis, Reuben, the eldest son, is stripped of his birthright due to his transgression. Similarly, Simeon and Levi, Jacob's next sons, face disqualification for their violent retaliation against the men of Shechem. Ultimately, it's Judah who is prophesied by Jacob to inherit the leadership mantle of Israel. David, a direct fulfillment of this prophecy, ironically experiences events mirroring those of his forefather Jacob. This cyclical narrative pattern suggests a single authorial vision behind these biblical tales. They can be interpreted as theorized by Levi Strauss in both a linear, diachronic, and a layered, synchronic manner. Genesis, in its essence, seems to be forward-looking, anticipating the future monarchy of Israel. This forward-looking perspective is further emphasized when Genesis lists the lineage of Edom's descendants and its kings, noting that these kings ruled before any king reigned over the Israelites. I hope you enjoyed the comparisons of Wajdenbaum's parallels in the Greek stories. Now we'll move to Bruce Louden. Homer, Argonauts, and the Old Testament. Bruce Louden. Dr. Bruce Louden wrote a great book called Homer's Odyssey in the Near East, which echoes much of what Dr. Philippe Wajdenbaum says about Greek connections to the Bible. He highlights the significance of the 3 occurrences of women at the well being betrothed and how this has parallel significance to Homer's Odyssey, but how there is a clear influence of the Argonautic myth on Homer as well. This will bring Jason and Medea into the picture. Odysseus' interactions with Nausicaa, the Phaeacian athletes, and her father Alcinous intriguingly mirrors what Alter describes as the betrothal type scene from the Old Testament. Let's first unpack 3 prominent Old Testament examples of this narrative pattern, and then delve into its parallels with Odysseus and the Nausicaa story. In the Old Testament, Abraham sends a loyal servant on a mission to find a wife for his son Isaac. The servant stops at a well in Nahor, a common gathering spot for women. He prays to Yahweh for guidance, asking for a sign. The woman who offers him water and also waters his camels would be the chosen one. Enter Rebekah, who fits this description perfectly. After a series of exchanges, it's revealed that Rebekah is related to Abraham, and she eventually agrees to marry Isaac. Fast forward and we find Jacob escaping his brother Esau's anger. On a similar quest in Nahor, at a well he meets Rachel, and after a series of events their relationship blossoms. Another parallel is seen in Moses' story. Fleeing Egypt, Moses stops by a well in Midian. He helps the 7 daughters of the priest Reuel, leading to his eventual marriage of one of them, Zipporah. Now let's look at Odysseus. His meeting with Nausicaa by the river echoes these Old Testament well encounters. Athena, in a dream, nudges Nausicaa to the river, where she's bound to meet Odysseus. While the Old Testament stories often center on the male perspective, the Odyssey offers a refreshing change by focusing on Nausicaa's viewpoint. The divine intervention, the emphasis on marriage, and the portrayal of Nausicaa's beauty are reminiscent of the Old Testament tales. In the Odyssey, water locations, be it rivers or wells, serve as meeting points. While Alter suggests wells might symbolize femininity, both the Odyssey and Old Testament use these water sources as places where foreign men meet local women. The tasks these women perform, like fetching water or washing, highlight their domestic virtues. Nausicaa's actions the next day, asking her father for a wagon to wash clothes, hint at her marriage preparations. This mirrors Rebekah's story, where her father allows her to decide her departure. As Nausicaa heads to the river, it's reminiscent of Rachel and Zipporah's tales, where they tend to their father's animals by the water. The narrative then shifts to Odysseus, who wakes up startled and naked by the river. As he approaches Nausicaa, he's in a vulnerable state, unlike the men in the Old Testament stories. His eloquent plea to Nausicaa, praising her beauty and hinting at her future marriage, is unique to the Odyssey but touches on themes present in the Old Testament. Odysseus' interactions with Nausicaa and her people echo a recurring pattern, a narrative pattern seen in the Old Testament, often termed the quote-unquote betrothal type scene, end quote. Let's break down these parallels for clarity. In the Old Testament, when Abraham's servants seek a wife for Isaac, he stops at a well in Nahor. There, Rebekah offers him water, a gesture of hospitality and kindness. Similarly, Nausicaa offers Odysseus a bath, a subset of chores women typically perform by the water. This act of kindness is mirrored in the Old Testament stories, like when Moses helps Zipporah and her sisters at the well in Midian. Nausicaa's perception of Odysseus evolves after he bathed and dressed. She begins to see him as a potential husband, expressing a wish that he might stay and become her spouse. This sentiment of attraction or connection at first meeting is a hallmark of the betrothal type scene. As the story progresses, Nausicaa guides Odysseus towards the city. Along the way, he prays to Athena, much like Abraham's servant prayed to Yahweh in his quest. Athena then appears as a young girl with a water pitcher, reminiscent of the Old Testament scenes where young women are encountered at wells. Odysseus' interactions with the Phaeacians, especially the sudden marriage proposal from Alcinous, mirrors Jacob's experiences with Laban in the Old Testament. Just as Alcinous quickly proposes a union between Odysseus and Nausicaa, similar swift proposals are seen in the Old Testament. Interestingly, while Alcinous' hasty offer draws criticism, Old Testament characters making similar offers are not judged as harshly. In essence, Odysseus' journey and encounters with Nausicaa and her people are steeped in narrative patterns reminiscent of the Old Testament's betrothal type scenes. Jacob and Jason's narratives are enriched by the presence of influential female mentors. For Jacob, this guiding figure is his mother, Rebekah. She played a pivotal role in shaping his destiny, especially in counteracting Isaac's preference for Esau. Rebekah masterminds Jacob's deception of Isaac and Esau and orchestrates his escape from Esau's wrath. Her reassuring words,
"Only obey my voice,"
echo the protective interventions of Hera for Jason. Just as Hera aids Jason, often in disguise, Rebekah's actions for Jacob are sometimes attributed to divine intervention, as when Jacob credits Yahweh for the quick procurement for venison. Rebekah's role has striking parallels with Hera, especially when considering another mythological narrative, that of Heracles in the Iliad, Book 19. In this tale, Zeus intends to bestow blessings upon his favored son, Heracles. However, Hera cunningly diverts these blessings to her preferred choice, Eurystheus. The parallels between the two stories are evident. Both fathers, Isaac and Zeus, inadvertently misdirect their blessings due to the machinations of their wives, Rebekah and Hera. The intended recipients, Esau and Heracles, share several characteristics. Both are portrayed as heroic figures, hunters, and are notably hirsute. Esau's description in particularly aligns with the characteristics often associated with Heracles. Despite their prowess and their father's favor, both end up subservient to the chosen ones of their mothers or stepmothers. My personal note is I think maybe both of these narratives were influenced by the earlier Gilgamesh hero, but that's a side note. Laban and Aetes are both tricky dads in old stories. They make the main characters Jacob and Jason jump through hoops before they can marry their daughters. Here's the scoop. Rebekah, Jacob's mom, wanted him to stay with Laban, her brother, for just a short while. But between trying to avoid his angry brother, Esau, and wanting to marry Laban's daughter, Rachel, Jacob ends up staying much longer. Why? Because Laban keeps changing the rules. First, he makes Jacob work for 7 years to marry Rachel. But after these years, Laban tricks Jacob and gives him his older daughter, Leah, instead. This sneaky move is a bit like what Laomedon, a king from another story, did when he didn't pay 2 gods after they did a job for him. Aetes, from the Jason story, is also a tricky dad. He sets terms for Jason, but then doesn't stick to them. When Jason first meets Aetes, he talks about another sneaky guy, Peleus. Jason basically went from dealing with one difficult person, Peleus, to another, Aetes. Both Jacob and Jason had problems at home and then faced more problems with the fathers of the women they wanted to marry. To sum it up, both these dads, Laban and Aetes, remind us of a description of Peleus from an old poem. They're both pretty sly and challenging.
For I give over to you the sheep, the tawny herds of cattle, and all the fields which you stole from my parents, and administer to fatten your wealth. I do not mind if these overly enrich your house.
Kind of surmising a lot of chapter 6 from Dr. Bruce Loudon's work. Number 1, Laban and Aetes. Laban and Aetes are portrayed as devious fathers of the protagonist's love interest. Their characters are characterized by deceit and manipulation. Laban's pursuit of Jacob is aggressive and threatening. His sons who accompany him express a hostile attitude towards Jacob. This mirrors Absarto's pursuit on behalf of Aetes in the Argonautica. Absarto, Aetes' son, is depicted as holding the reins of Helios' chariot, emphasizing his ability to pursue. He leads a group of Colchians to chase after Jason, who has taken Aetes' fleece. Similarly, Laban pursues Jacob, who has taken his household gods. Laban's treatment of Jacob is reminiscent of Aetes' behavior towards Jason. Both protagonists face challenges imposed by these father figures. For instance, Jacob has to work for several years due to Laban's cunning, just as Jason has to undertake labors specified by Aetes. 2. Absarto and Laban's pursuit. Absarto, representing Aetes, pursues the protagonist as they flee with valuable items. His ability to chase is hinted at in scenes where he controls Helios' chariot. Laban, on the other hand, overtakes Jacob in a landlocked parallel. This pursuit is intensified by the aggressive stance of Laban's sons. Absarto, leading a group of Colchians, outmaneuvers Jason, trapping him where the river Easter separates around a group of islands. In a similar vein, Laban overtakes Jacob, camping opposite him in Gilead. The chapter also touches upon the aggressive nature of Rachel, who steals Laban's household gods. This act is paralleled with Medea's role in the Argonautica, where she plays a significant part in the theft of the Golden Fleece. 3. Jason's confrontation with Esau. Jason's confrontation in the Argonautica are paralleled with Jacob's anticipated violent encounter with his brother Esau. However, while Jason faces multiple confrontations, Jacob's narrative culminates in reconciliation. Number 4, Medea's magic and Rachel's desire for offspring. Medea's use of Prometheon, or Prometheus, drug is a significant aspect of the Argonautica. The plant's root, which resembles, quote, newly cut flesh, end quote, plays a pivotal role in the narrative. In the Old Testament, Rachel's desire for offspring from Jacob mirrors Medea's magical endeavors, though the methods differ.
But she said to her, "Wasn't it enough that you took away my husband? Will you take my son's mandrakes too?" "Very well," Rachel said. "He can sleep with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes."
Though Rachel is not a witch, as is Medea, magic is present, even prominent in her myth. Unable to bear children, when she learns that Leah's first son, Reuben, has found some mandrakes, Rachel asks if she may use them, presumably as an aphrodisiac. In Apollonius's account, a love charm in the form of Eros's agency is the central means of assuring Medea will unite with Jason. In Jacob's myth, Rachel, already married to Jacob, seizes upon a similar agent to obtain offspring from him. Apollonius's key depiction of Medea's magic describes her use of the Promethean drug. Son of Israel, Judah, then the dreamer. So many examples pile up. After a while, you're left with no choice but to seriously dive into the Greek world for the biblical narrative sources. In our next installments, we will dive into the son of Israel, Judah, and then Joseph, the favorite son of Jacob, aka Israel, and the child of Israel's favorite wife, Rachel. I sincerely want to hear your thoughts about these connections in the comment section. Please like, comment, subscribe, and hit that bell. If you really enjoy what we're doing in these videos, I ask that you consider joining Mythvision's Patreon and YouTube membership programs. We could really use your support to continue these documentaries, bringing this information out there. I know, because I watch YouTube as a YouTube content creator, there is no channel out there that is doing what I'm doing with this series. You have to hunt and find this material deep, deep down in literature, and nobody is taking it into MP4 content where it is being expressed in this manner. I wish there were videos out there like this. In fact, I started Mythvision for that sole purpose. I saw a lack of certain content that I was enjoying and wanting that was in books that I've read, and nobody had performed videos on them. Here I am doing that with this series. Please help back us. Support what we're doing. Join us. It helps us commit to doing this kind of work. I plan on doing this all the way through the entire Bible and into the New Testament. I also hope to get into Islam, the Quran. My whole goal is to bring you that mythological angle that you don't find out there very often. Until next time, we are Mythvision.